Well, good afternoon. My name is Michelle Dillon. As many of you know by now, I'm Interim Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. Thank you all for coming today. This is one of our favorite events in the university and especially, of course, in the college. It's the Lindbergh Award celebrates excellence in faculty research, teaching, and scholarship. And I'm thrilled that I'm in this position today to introduce this year's highly deserving award winner, Professor Paula Savio from the Department of Education. Professor Savio is an expert teacher in a wide range of courses at both the undergraduate and graduate level. And she is deeply committed to students' personal and professional growth well beyond the classroom, as a great many of her students attest. Professor Savio's scholarship reflects an innovative and broad approach to educational studies. She applies diverse theoretical frameworks and modes of inquiry to a variety of educational situations and settings. Her most recent book is The Story Takers: Public Pedagogy and Contemporary Italy's Nonviolent Resistance Against the Mafia. Other books include Anne Sexton, Teacher of Weird Abundance, which won a Critics' Choice Award from the American Educational Studies Association, the co-authored book Community-Based Media Pedagogies, Relational Practices of Listening in the Commons, and the co-edited volume Love's Return: Psychoanalytic Essays on Childhood, Teaching and Learning. Professor Savio has published numerous refereed articles and book chapters on a variety of topics, from food blogs to photojournalism. The quality of her scholarship has been recognized with support from the US Department of Education, the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council, the Verizon Foundation, and the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, among others. For her outstanding work, Professor Savio has been recognized with the Lindbergh Award and, of course, is here today to speak with us. Her talk, the title of it is Crime That Pays: Mafia Capitalism, Public Education and the Liberal Arts. And I know for one, I'll be particularly attentive to hearing some best practices from the Mafia for how we can strengthen the college. So it's a great pleasure to introduce and to welcome Paula. Please welcome.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle, for that generous introduction. I'm afraid I don't have any legal tactics for addressing how to improve the College of Liberal Arts financial situation. But I want to thank...
Best practices.
Oh, best practices, right. But I want to thank everybody for being here this afternoon. I'm honored to receive the Lindbergh Award. Since joining the faculty at UNH in 1992, I've been exceptionally fortunate to teach and to study in a Department of Education that has given me intellectual friends who have done so much necessary and inspired work to establish the Department of Education as a regional and national leader, particularly at a time when the privatization of public education has never been so severe, at a time when the wrenching of professional authority from educators has never been so profound. Each of my department colleagues understand the sheer ingenuity, intellectual, political, and imaginative, that is required to engage in and sustain efforts to make a first-rate education possible for all students, and to educate teachers responsively in the arts of love and perseverance in the face of difficult times. My colleagues in the College of Liberal Arts continue to offer me the gifts of friendship and intellectual generosity. I want to thank Bert Feintuck and my colleagues at the Center for the Humanities for repeatedly extending their hospitality to me with the privilege of the Center for Humanities Fellowships. I'm also very grateful to the John Carney Fellowship, which is sponsored by the Namaste Foundation and UNH alum Janet Spadora, for sponsoring many, many years of my research in Italy. I'm also deeply grateful to Amy Boylan and Piero Garofalo, and for both of them for so many reasons, particularly for their insights into the questions of Italian history in southern Italy. Their work has been indispensable for my thinking through of the variety of ways in which the anti-mafia work as a substantial educational force in contemporary Italy. As many of you know, I spent the last 10 years studying the anti-mafia movement in Sicily. This afternoon, I'd like to use this scholarship to speculate about the current state of public education in the United States, and to consider how the strategies of the Sicilian anti-mafia movement might be relevant to resisting the ongoing assault on public education, particularly public higher education. That assault has intensified under what I refer to as mafia capitalism. I shall begin by framing a working definition of mafia capitalism, distinguishing it from the kind of neoliberal regulatory capitalism we might associate with the Clinton, Bush, Obama administrations, and then trace its impact on public education. I shall then suggest two lessons that I've learned from anti-mafia activists working in Sicily, lessons that have relevance to our work as educators. A year and a half ago, soon after Trump fired FBI Director James Comey, Comey said in an interview that working with Trump actually reminded him of his dealings with the mafia. At that time, I wrote an op-ed piece. I had never imagined that my research in Italy on mafia would become so relevant to living in the United States. And I wrote an op-ed piece titled "Trafficking in Loyalty, Trump's Mafia-like Ways Call for Anti-Mafia Tactics." And the piece opened as follows. As a professor of education who studies and writes about the mafia and the anti-mafia movements in Italy, I have been interested in how analyses of President Trump often position him as a fascist or compare him to Mussolini or to Hitler. Trump is not a fascist. He doesn't need to establish a one-party system to advance his business interests and to pursue his personal goals. Trump is an authoritarian who demands absolute loyalty, not to the GOP, but to himself and to his business interests. In the mafia and regimes they have infiltrated, loyalty to the leader is paramount. Once the boss is provoked to question someone's loyalty, that person in question is eliminated. And we've seen a pattern of that for the years. The point I intended to make in this op-ed piece was that it is more fruitful to understand Trump's approach to government in terms of the mafia than to compare Trump to fascist leaders or to categorize his policies and his party's policies in terms of neoliberalism. In its simplest terms, neoliberalism, as University of Berkeley's Wendy Brown writes, configures all aspects of existence in economic terms, translating humans into commodities or numbers, or to put it more bluntly, in terms of money. Certainly much of the critique of austerity politics, the widening income gap, the carceral state which targets Black males and undocumented immigrants, and the imposition of audit culture and testing regimes on public schools, colleges, and universities has been phrased as a critique of neoliberal capitalism. Today, however, I want to suggest that it may be more a posit to think about our current situation, not in terms of neoliberalism, but in terms of what anthropologist and anarchist activist David Graeber labeled mafia capitalism. I also want to think aloud with you about lessons drawn from the nonviolent opposition to mafia capitalism that I studied in Sicily and their relevance to resisting the assault on public education, both in the K through 12 arena as well as in higher education. So what is mafia capitalism? The word mafia comes to us from a Sicilian Arabic slang expression, meaning acting as a protector against the arrogance of the powerful. And it connotes safety for those granted protection from abuse. The organizational structure of the mafia is characterized by familial and friendship relations and shared business interests. It is built in a pyramid-like order through a family network that weaves through society and is headed by a head of family or godfather who doles out rewards for undying obedience and omertà, which is an oath of silence that one takes. And I'll return to this, the concept of omertà, the practice of omertà, shortly. The mafia state traffics in loyalty, not truth, and it trades in favors rather than respecting ethical engagements. David Graeber coined the phrase mafia capitalism to express what he saw as the palpable element of violent coercion at the heart of financial globalization. So some, such as Robert Kuttner, have labeled mafia capitalism as predatory capitalism. Others, such as the Reverend James Lawson, refer to it as plantation capitalism. Unlike capitalism with a human face, a capitalism we might associate with Roosevelt, Truman, and Johnson, and today's progressive Democrats, that is capitalism that is heavily regulated by the government, mafia capitalism, as described by the late Italian mafia prosecutor Giovanni Falcone, becomes the state when the state is tragically absent. Mafia capitalism thrives in and works toward the dismantling of any interventions by the government in the social and economic realms. It seeks to deregulate the market and social institutions. It undermines or dismantles regulations that produce potential equality of outcomes or that seek to make the market and institutions more inclusive or that might mitigate the extreme consequences of privatization. So mafia capitalism can be characterized by some of the following: translating basic human rights, such as the right to health care, physical security, and housing, into privileges that can be granted or refused; brokering favors for businessmen, landowners, and politicians; showing an extreme tendency toward economic devolution to the hands of the few, combined with a minimal tendency toward cultural evolution; and perhaps most importantly, substituting loyalty for truth and privileging favors over ethics or rights. Now, one could argue that these three latter aspects distinguish, at least on the surface, mafia capitalism from the neoliberalism of, for example, the Tea Party, the Cato Institute, the Koch network, and many in the Republican Party. But I would suggest, following historian Nancy MacLean and journalist Jane Mayer's work in retrospectively Democracy in Chains and Dark Money, that these groups offer only a gentlemanly facade for policies and right-wing ideologies that can be labeled mafia capitalism. As MacLean and Mayer document, the end result of these policies leaves power and wealth in the hands of a few who both make and are beyond the law and who, in the words of MacLean, want to fundamentally alter the rules of democratic governance as we have known it in the United States. Now, this is a moment to pause, because the United States' founding claim to democracy was an essential contradiction. How can a nation founded on settler colonialism, genocide of native peoples, enslavement of African American peoples, and capitalist exploitation claim to have a democratic legacy? There can be no political democracy without economic democracy, racial and gender justice. By bringing the words mafia, state, and capitalism together, scholars such as Hungarian writer Bálint Magyar aim to trace the collapse of constitutionally protected democratic norms that undergird the state and their replacement by a system built on loyalty or strong ties, protection for some at the expense of others, and the devolution of power into the hands of a few. So those who amass the greatest amount of property or money, argues MacLean, believe that they have actually earned the right to rule the nation. They deserve this rule. And there's actually been studies that I think are quite problematic with students who are asked whether or not, and these are elementary school students, if you, what are some of the characteristics of people with money? And they really believe that people who have more money are more intelligent. So this is an interesting study that I will return to. How that capital is amassed doesn't matter. It can be amassed through banking secrecy, tax havens and scams, forms of extortion, and fraud. The international reach of what Italian sociologist Umberto Santino describes as the financial mafia is protected from controls on capital. According to Magyar, who is primarily writing about Orbán's Hungary, but could as well be describing Trump's Republican Party, we no longer need an underworld, given that the organized overworld has replaced the need for underworld operations. One might also argue that the palpable violence Graebner claims is at the heart of mafia capitalism distinguishes it from neoliberal market-based forms of capitalism. And I would argue, however, that the approaches to policing and the gratuitous violence to which Black, Native American, and Latinx populations, women and sexual minorities, and more recently, undocumented immigrants are subjected to, and the indirect violence experienced by the impoverished are consistent with mafia violence. Certainly, if we follow the work of Orlando Patterson and Frank Wilderson, or those associated with the Afro-pessimism movement, the parallels to mafia violence are clear. These writers argue that the African Americans are A, open to gratuitous violence as opposed to violence contingent upon some kind of transgression. They are natally alienated. their ties of birth are not recognized, and their familial structures are intentionally broken apart. Generally, they are dishonored or disgraced before any thought or action is considered. Finally, some might counter that neoliberal capitalism can be distinguished from mafia capitalism because there is no direct extortion in neoliberal capitalism. There is, for example, no pizzo, which is the protection money that's paid to the mafia. And pizzo refers to a bird, the beak of a bird taking a little bit of grain here and there, and that's the slang term used for extortion money. Anti-mafia activists describe this protection money as essentially a progressive tax that's imposed by the mafia on businesses. And this progressive tax, which ostensibly assures protection from mafia violence, also works to cultivate an eternally indebted person. Now, if we think of the work by Maurizio Lazzarto and David Graeber on the making of indebted persons, and consider how the privatization of public goods creates indebtedness, in that one goes into debt to meet basic human needs, one could argue that servicing that debt is analogous to paying extortion fees, or what the Italians refer to as pizzo. As Roberto Saviano writes about the Sicilian mafia, by making the population indebted, the great majority will remain in servitude to a minority, deprived of rights but dependent on favors. Journalist Alexander Stile, who has written extensively on mafia violence, argues that when citizens' basic rights to physical security, healthcare, and housing are turned into privileges that can be granted or refused, as they have been for generations in Palermo, people tend to turn for help to extra-legal authorities, such as the mafia. And such illegal turns, for example, to drug trafficking and black markets, can be understood as a traumatic response to a cumulative failure of the state to care for the people over time. To take one example of how mafia capitalism works to create debtors and extract resources through extortion, we need look no further than Puerto Rico. I don't believe it's an overstatement to say that Puerto Rico presents a clear case of a public debt amounting to not just 1, but 10 or 20 years of debt, intergenerational debt, and in effect creating what is, for all intents and purposes, a mafia-controlled state in which all production and all wealth creation is dedicated to the repayment of a debt overseen by an unelected few. I want to now turn to mafia capitalism's assault on public education. A year ago, Jan Werner Mueller, professor of politics at Princeton and author of What is Populism, wrote in the New York Review of Books, referring to Hungary's higher education crisis, "Rare is a government in today's world determined to make society less smart. But in strongman Viktor Orbán's Hungary, that is the case." In 2010, soon after winning the supermajority, Orbán immediately began to dismantle democratic laws and institutions, such as the media and the judiciary. We see a similar movement in the United States. There is little question that the Trump administration poses a grave threat to public education and to journalism, which of course plays a critical role in educating the public. Among its attempts to dismantle public education, we can include the following: devoting federal and state tax dollars to voucher programs that siphon funding from public education and education savings accounts that enable students to study at religious schools, virtual schools, online schools, charter schools, or at home with little or no oversight. Weakening or eliminating teacher certification requirements and encouraging for-profit or not-for-profit alternative teacher education programs. Destroying faculty and teacher unions, which we saw last summer with the Janus case. Removing or weakening laws that regulate for-profit institutions of higher ed and that prohibit predatory lending to college students. Turning power over to state legislatures to accredit K-12 higher education institutions. Curtailing tenure protections and reducing faculty governance, and undermining support for the liberal arts and humanities curriculum. And finally, starving public schools of funding. As so-called government schools, which is Betsy DeVos's name for public schools, disappear, yes, and public higher education itself comes to be seen by some, such as George Mason economist Brian Kaplan, as delivering nothing of lasting value, and as only an inefficient way to signal vague productive capacity to employers, the privatization of schools will accelerate. The public realm of education is left to languish. It must be said at this point, however, that many of the policies undermining public education that have been introduced by the Trump administration were intentionally or unintentionally set in motion by the regulatory neoliberal education policies of the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. Unfortunately, several of our educational organizations, such as the American Association for Colleges of Teacher Education, Division K of the American Educational Research Association, and the American Association for Higher Education embraced, and in some instances continue to embrace, these policies. And I want to note that I am implicated in, given my participation in many of these institutions, and I suggest many of us here are implicated. These policies emphasizing transparency, accountability, and that ever-elusive excellence not only imposed audit culture and regimes of testing on schools and teacher education, but in doing so rendered teaching, learning, and the curriculum as fungible and quantifiable, and in the process stripped them of any real intellectual content or critical capacities and stripped teachers of autonomy. As Bill Reddings foresaw so many years ago, higher education moved from a Humboldtian model to a corporate model that measured itself and was measured by outputs, or what is termed learning outcomes. I know many of you have been grappling with, at the K through 12 level, we've been dealing with learning outcomes for a long time, but I think I got an email from Stephen last year about, what is learning outcome, right? The result was a skyrocketing intuition and administration transformed into central management, or referred to as the managerial class, and departments increasingly isolated from one another, competing for students and scarce financial resources. Perhaps most painful was that the informal bonds of civility that tie a university community together, that is also, and this is also the case in K through 12 education, became stretched to the breaking point and in many cases shattered. Departments increasingly saw their primary purpose to please management, and management came to focus on carrying out the endless cascades of increasingly meaningless university reforms and obsessing over three bureaucratic concepts: transparency, accountability, and excellence. Finally, the very language used to discuss curriculum, teaching, and the purposes of education became more and more instrumentalized and technocratic. The result, I would argue, was exactly what Falcone and Stile saw as the conditions for the rise of the mafia: the cumulative failure of the state to care for the people over time. Students were forced into debt, education was rendered primarily as a means to a better job, teacher education became a bundle of scripts and cliches, learning became a set of measurable outcomes, and departments starved of resources. And as a result, they were forced to compete for bodies, teachers, and professors felt that their autonomy threatened. Adjuncts replaced tenure faculty, thus increasing the precariat and management, and workers fought over financial debt. So all of this downsizing in the name of marketing strategies made people not only uncared for, but we became set up for a mafia capitalism. I want to now speculate about what we might learn from the anti-mafia movement in Sicily, lessons that might suggest ways to resist the effects of mafia capitalism on public education. Now, I certainly do not want to romanticize the anti-mafia movement. Much of my scholarship has focused on the problems of that movement, problems ranging from sexism to classism, from monumentalizing heroes to erasing history with heroic narratives and valorizing martyrdom. I do think, however, that we can, in our struggle against mafia capitalism's predations on public education, learn from the movement. In particular, I want to focus on the work of the anti-extortion campaigns of Adio Pizzo and Adio Pizzo Travel. And Adio Pizzo Travel is a separate branch, but they're connected, that runs travel studies trips. And I know some of our students have gone on these trips. So maybe during discussion, I know Amy Boylan was a part of that. Might be able to say a few words. I want to suggest that what we can learn may help to create conditions in which faculty and students do feel cared for, and may offer ways to challenge mafia capitalism's assault on public education. These two lessons, working in solidarity with others and engaging in a critical public pedagogy, are not in any way mutually exclusive. In fact, there is a great deal of overlap between them. I also in no way want to suggest that these lessons are solutions. So I'm not offering solutions by any means. I'm trying to open up a conversation. I offer them only to prompt discussion about what tactics we might employ in the face of the assault on public education. As you know, this year saw teacher strikes in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, and Washington. Smaller scale protests by school staff in Kentucky, North Carolina, Colorado, a school bus driver strike in Georgia, and protests over pay by the adjunct professors at Virginia Commonwealth University. While the results have been mixed, those strikes certainly brought attention to the ongoing economic assault on public education. We also saw student walkouts over gun violence, continuing women's protests against the Trump administration, and ongoing protests against police violence and the ICE detentions. And the student movement to abolish student debt was particularly active this year. Other than the Ferris State strike by professors in Michigan, however, the professoriate has been quiet. It's true that the anti-mafia movement is not known for striking. In fact, they have a tradition of what are called reverse strikes. So as a brief example, historically, when they're told in the southern part of Italy and Sicily that there are no federal funds for building roads, communities actually come together and they build the roads themselves. And and many of the leaders are put in prison for that. But so they're not striking as in refraining from labor, they're taking on the labor that they are committed to. I would suggest, however, that the refusal, when I think of Adio Pizzo and they refuse to pay their campaign is one that refuses to pay extortion fees, that in that refusal to pay an extortion fee, that constitutes a kind of strike. And I would ask us to consider seriously what it would mean for professors here, tenured lecturers and adjunct faculty, in solidarity with indebted students and their families, to consider imaginative ways to strike as a tactic to fight against Mafia Capitalism's assault on public education, particularly with respect to creating an indebted generation. Working in solidarity with others is a practice that holds the promise of protection from the predations of Mafia Capitalism and opportunities to secure enjoyment in the service of truth. A form of enjoyment that undermines a culture of depression, silence, which is omertà, and isolation. So Comey did not abide by the law of omertà, and that's why he was eliminated. According to the law of omertà, if you bear witness to a violent act, you do not report it to the authorities, or you'll be eliminated. Omertà is a code of silence that demands absolute loyalty to the mafia. It's a refusal to speak of crimes, no matter how violent. The anti-extortion campaigns of Adio Pizzo and Adio Pizzo Travel confront the complex challenges of creating and sustaining an ethical economy in the very midst of mafia terror, with the intention of, in the words of Hannah Arendt, renewing a common world. And in the work of renewing a common world, we take up the project of trying to cultivate and sustain plurality. And plurality, solidarity, implies the people you don't like live there. So in fact, plurality could be dangerous, it could be violent, because the very people that you don't agree with and that you may vehemently disagree with will still be there. But how do we engage in civil discourse, in nonviolent engagement? During what Adio Pizzo calls their ethical tours of Palermo, members of Adio Pizzo speak publicly against the mafia violence. They offer walking tours with students and visitors to Sicily that challenge stereotypes of mafiosi, and they tell stories that honor the long legacy of nonviolent resistance against the mafia, rather than solely privileging stories of victimhood. Their campaigns against the mafia refrain from seeking individual solutions to the social, political, and economic challenges the mafia poses to democratic life, and they turn to a principle of communal responsibility that promotes the values of a social state. And here I'm drawing on the work of sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, who describes a social state as one that promotes the principle of communally endorsed collective insurance against individual misfortune and its consequences, so that members of society are not only beneficiaries but actors, responsible for the creation and availability of benefits, such as a first-rate education. Adio Pizzo's focus on narratives of nonviolent resistance make an important contribution to understanding how societies transitioning from totalitarian authority to more democratic practices use narrative to work through traumatic injury, and how the act of remembering and the retelling of resistant actions as stories might save the lives and actions of social actors from the oblivion of historical forgetfulness. And this is why history becomes so vital to our curriculum. To turn toward the world in solidarity with others with the intention of engaging in and sustaining memories of resistance to and of victimization by mafia capitalism, particularly those that are obscured under the category of state secret, challenges the many ways in which mafia capitalism works to undermine possibilities for justice. Adio Pizzo offers us insights into the ways in which a death-affirming, melancholic, depressive position can be replaced with a life-affirming politics of natal pleasure that has the potential to create the conditions of possibility for new beginnings and requires resilience and the capacity to endure the failure that is inherent in human finitude. The second lesson involves the role that critical pedagogy can play in contesting the effects on higher education of mafia capitalism. Anti-mafia activists Edward Zavuto, Franco Zecchine, Umberto Santino, and journalist Roberto Saviani, and here I'm going to add the activist band that I'm going to be introducing today, in Percussione, see themselves as community teachers, and they are committed to a critical pedagogy that has specific narrative and aesthetic features that are used to address ethical questions, such as what memories of violence and resistance are worthy of attention, and how should the violence of mafia capitalism be judged? And the narratives of resistance, nonviolent resistance, are really important to attend to within the context of transitional justice, because very often in truth and reconciliation projects, we focus only on narratives of victimization and not on resistance. And I'm going to talk, if people are interested, we can talk a little bit about why that has become the case. Such a pedagogy urges a renewed commitment to educate our communities, to create, and this is a little elusive, but to create, in the words of Umberto Santino, anti-mafia practices of daily living. So what would it mean for all of us to be thinking about what that might look like? I think some of you have already done that work and are doing that work. These anti-mafia practices of daily living include affinitive strategies of resistance through the use of social and new media, storytelling, and bearing witness, keeping in mind that narrating, in the words of Italian writer Anna Lucarelli, is resisting. It is not forgetting. This may sound very simple, but to narrate, to tell stories, is to directly engage and challenge omerta, the vow of silence, that steals subjectivity, that creates isolation, and cultivates depression. Narrating performs a twofold act of resistance. It claims the right to speak out against crime and oppression, and it also puts the crimes of mafia capitalism in the public eye. In simple terms, as anti-mafia prosecutor Pietro Grasso cautioned, the mafia thrives on silence, and so long as it exists, people must talk about it, discuss it, and respond. Don Luigi Ciotti, the father of Liberatera, reminds us of the etymological roots of the word resist. It comes from the same root as to exist. It means substance. It means being there. It means doing. The lessons of solidarity are not limited, however, to the cooperative struggle of bodies in space. It also refers to a kind of thinking that moves across boundaries, that is non-hierarchical, and that both coheres around and is motivated by particular questions and issues. It involves creating spaces for experimenting and the emergence of new forms of subjectivity. And finally, focusing on inventing new forms of community free of hierarchy and domination. So working in solidarity, grounded in anti-mafia practices of daily living, is already alive in curricular and pedagogical initiatives in our college. Think of, for example, the Civic Discourse Lab in the Department of Communications, the Puerto Rico Lab in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, the unified pedagogical efforts in the Department of Anthropology to decolonize the curriculum. I also think of the work taken up by the Abenaki community with Lana Peshkova and anthropology students, as well as the critical race dialogue sponsored by the Department of Education's Community Literacy Lab. This is a short list. There's a lot of work that's going on here. In my estimation, each of these spaces are examples where we might come together to explore how we might initiate transformative policy reforms or a strategy of non-reformist reforms to align immediate struggles for people's needs with the long-term goal of anti-racist, anti-mafia capitalist alternatives. Non-reformist reforms weaken systems of oppression, and they shift power relations. Transformative policy reforms that target mafia capitalism and insist on equity, reparations, and self-determination are on the agendas of emerging social movements in education and beyond. The movement for Black Lives Matter that is calling for racial justice in education includes demands for the redistribution of resources, reparations for past harm. I think this is really relevant when we think about the indebted person. Control and expanded social rights to public goods. This work is aligned with the work of anti-extortion campaigns in Italy, and it speaks to an ever-rising global movement to a clear articulation of the right to a first-rate free education for all, rather than solely for an elite few. Following the artistry and teachings of anti-mafia photojournalists Franco Zacchine and Letizia Battaglia, perhaps we might extend this critical public pedagogical impulse to reach out to our communities, to engage them in teach-ins, pop-up exhibitions, and mobile symposia that address the impact of mafia capitalism on public education. The pedagogical tactics of anti-mafia activists teach us, and here I paraphrase Pulitzer Prize-winning author Ta-Nehisi Coates, that you have to find peace within the chaos. You have to find some sort of mission in the chaos. You have to devote yourself to the struggle within the chaos, with no assurance that you will see any victory in your lifetime. I want to conclude by showing you a very short video of an anti-mafia protest that through music, dance, and masks of anti-mafia activists, prosecutors, and educators creates conditions for keeping legacies alive. And it sort of introduces this idea of those anti-mafia daily practices. The performance, which is by a group called Impercussione, embodies the hope, joy, and fulfillment that works to make the transgression of expressive limits imposed by Omerta and fuels the desire to renew a common world in the name of civil society. And what you're going to hear, and I'll be interesting what actors and musicians pick up here, are going to be instruments from diverse epochs. Jack Lanneman may find this really interesting, the mix of sound. There's going to be 3 10-foot long drone pipes that play. And these pipes originate from their ancient Australian Aboriginal, they come from an ancient Aboriginal culture. And there's the maranzano of Sicily, there's drums and guitars. And what they are doing is literally, they're creating a procession through the streets of Catania, which is part of Sicily, to bring alive and sustain the legacies of anti-mafia activists and, as they call them, martyrs of justice. So we're ready?